Okay, so my mandate is to keep you all continue awake and in the room. What I did here was basically, you can think of these two talks as, basically lines going off to infinity in different directions, where it's like, one is like the AI singularity is going to, deliver us. The other one is like, we're going to, we have these cataclysmic events that kind of reduce inequality, and so that's the theme of Walter's talk. And so what I'm going to do is start with Walter and then work backwards to Simon's. So Walter's challenge is basically that there's an inequality peace frontier, and it's extremely steep. And basically, so if you want to really reduce inequality, then you've kind of got to, the price we historically have paid for that is an enormous number of dead people. And so basically, the thesis is that the reducing inequality is only accomplished by kind of these social catastrophes of plague and war. And it's even worse than that, because not even the catastrophes are sufficient. They're just necessary. And it's like having a catastrophe doesn't guarantee that you're going to get the inequality reduction. It's just like you're not going to get it otherwise. And so it's a challenge if you think that inequality is bad and peace is good. And I think most people probably think inequality is a little bit bad and peace is a little bit good. And so it suggests that there's a trade-off. I want to sort of step back and sort of maybe reject the premise that the war is exogenous. Because, and it sort of pushes back at some themes that came up earlier today. It's just like, what are the units in which we care about inequality? And like kind of the term it's in my head is like methodological nationalism, where it's like you're basically, the units are these boundaried societies that you're like, inequality is a thing in this society and somehow is not associated with the things that are happening in another society. But when it comes to war, they're tied. And so we should think about them kind of jointly. And I'm not the first person to do this. There's a long line of classic theorists of high empire that sort of had the view that inequality at home was deeply tied up with imperatives for war abroad. And basically it's similar to mechanisms that are in Piketty and in Walter, which is essentially as capital accumulates in a poor country, the rate of return falls unless you can find some other potential source of growth to keep R up, and that's often investing abroad. And those foreign investments are what keeps R high, even as like you kind of hit diminishing returns at home. But you need to get that money back and make sure that it's protected. And because there's no transnational sovereign, ultimately the thing that protects that is expeditionary forces and Marines and what have you. And so that you wind up then having to get these militaries as sort of and a particular sort of orientation towards geopolitics as a result of the kind of accumulation of capital at home. And so you get these hypertrophied militaries. And they're tinderboxes where I think tomorrow's the anniversary of Gavrilo Princip assassination of the Archduke, and so you get these tinderboxes where everyone's tied up in these treaties. There's lots of militaries on the ground, and it just takes one thing to set the whole thing off. And so in that light, right, what Walter's sort of considering a shock is in fact like just part of the system working itself out. And we shouldn't necessarily think of like the war as exogenous from the inequality. It's like part of the process. And then again, away from just the domestic focus, right, is that one of the things that's happening is that you're having convergence between, say, the hegemon or the frontier economies and these like late developers. And it sounds familiar in 2023, and that's leading to geopolitical rivalry, partly because of the economic convergence between like a late developer and the frontier, and that's creating conflicts over like expectations around trade agreements, around who gets what rights to invest in what. And so I think we should, putting this together, I think we should, take the kind of 1910-ish view of foreign policy as endogenous to the economy and like maybe dust it off a bit. So Branko Milanovic and I have tried to do this, but we can never get the paper published, so it's just kind of sitting there. So, but this was kind of our attempt to kind of put some data behind some of the Hobson et al. Claims, which is this is like this is just among the people with wealth. So this starts at the 93rd percentile and then is like within that, and basically you can kind of see the share of foreign assets in the portfolios of the ultra rich are extremely high. So they're holding somewhere of like 5 to 6% of their portfolios are in imperial assets, foreign railroads, et cetera. It's even higher in France, and we have better data in France. And then this is just like some scatter plots kind of showing the share of military personnel as a function of net foreign assets over GDP. Probably you can't see it, but it's basically extremely upward sloping. And what that's picking up is in the late 19th century, as countries are sort of expanding their foreign portfolios, they're also putting more men under arms and kind of growing their armies. And you can kind of see this in the 15 years prior to World War I. It's just you have these incredible arms races between Germany and Britain, being the groundwork for World War I. So I think if you take that sort of seriously, then you kind of get like instead of this view of shocks and inequality, you kind of get much more of like a military or geopolitical Kuznets curve, where you kind of have an initial increase in inequality that creates the revolution or the war or and then that creates the leveling, and then you get kind of the compression afterwards. But then that's only, again, the within country. If you think of like the world, maybe if one of the things driving the war is kind of a compression of between country inequality, and then you have a conflagration, then what happens to the sort of relative standings and convergences and the economic convergence of those two countries? Does it stabilize? Does it increase again? I'm not sure. And so I just think it's like we should kind of, when looking through Walter's presentation, I was like, every one of these things is like inequality is here and independent of inequality over here. But in fact, I think in these interdependent systems, we might want to think about the relevant units of inequality as being larger than a nation state. And I say this coming as, from the US, where whenever I sort of see people comparing this European country to this European country, I'm like, yeah, that's about 1/2 the size of Texas, and the other half is like smaller than 1/3 of California. And I just think, why are those the relevant units that we're sort of holding as like fixed comparisons, when I think of all the variation that lives at the level of US states? And I'm like, that's pretty good. And actually, it sort of gives you a different lens on sort of the effects of war versus some of the peacetime measures. So for example, like the unionization stuff, one of the things you can sort of see is when you look at the variation across states, it's not every state that experiences the increase in unionization and in the middle of World War II, and it's in fact only like 1/3 of the states, but it's exactly only in those states that experience the increase in unionization that inequality falls. So it's not that the war is kind of, the war hits every state, but it's only the states that actually get the increase in unionization that get the fall in inequality. So I kind of just like want to push back a bit against this like focus on countries as the independent units of analysis. The other thing that I was thinking of, particularly in the pandemic portion, is sort of like what's the underlying economic model in going on here, and it's like kind of this after-tax Malthusianism that you have an elite, they tax the peasants, but then other than that, it's like the peasants just kind of are in a Malthusian economy, subject to the elite extracting whatever they're going to extract. And so state collapse gives you no more taxes, so that leads to a compression. But then basically everything else is just straight Malthus. And so you have like real wages are fixed at subsistence, and the productivity changes show up only as population increases. And so, you can only really change this wage-rental ratio or inequality by either these preventative or positive checks on population. And basically, like the talk is all about these positive checks, where you're just kind of wiping out a chunk of the population and watching wages go up. And it's almost like exactly like that's why we wouldn't care about inequality. It's like, yes, eliminating inequality by destroying the bottom end of the population that's poor, it does move the Gini coefficient, but it's not exactly what we're after when we think about reducing inequality. And so it's in some sense in which like it's like Goodhart's law: when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a measure. It's like if you're obsessed about if you trained an AI to obsess about the Gini coefficient, it would be like, I know how to reduce the Gini coefficient. Let's kill all the poor people. And so we should again, like coming back to what David was saying about why we should care about inequality. It's like we should have the underlying idea that there's like a larger notion of freedom and things underneath it that we're kind of trying to fix. But I did think it was interesting that one of the things that this points to is that if there are, a la Dawn of Everything, if there are these stably egalitarian societies that kind of pop up occasionally in history, or maybe were very persistent, they had low fertility and or abundant land, so they're able to escape this Malthusian dynamic for at least a period of time, but they wind up disappearing in the long run, partly because of like these group selection forces of war. It's that like egalitarianism in one society in a population of societies that are not egalitarian and are really good at fighting. There's going to be an upper bound on how egalitarian you can get in any one small-scale society without and you might find little examples of, oh wow, this group was amazing at maintaining an egalitarian population, but then it got wiped out as soon as it was encountered a more militarized population, and that's bad. But that's also probably the fair amount of historical evidence on it. I'll skip this as I'm running out of time. But yes, I have questions about Malthusianism. I have questions about, this is interesting. We talked about it a little bit, and Judy's not here anymore, but I think we should really also question the data underneath a lot of the wage measurements. I mean, they are what they are, but what they mean is I think we can continue to argue about. So, for example, that this is nominal wages in Masons right through the Black Death, and yes, you get an increase in nominal wages, but look at what the price index is doing. It's like going up and then going down, and then through that collapse of the price index, the nominal wage is just totally fixed. And it's just like, and as Bob knows, you look at these wage series in the original thing, and it's just year after year, it's the same number showing up on the playbook. And it's just like, that's not what the Malthusian model says. It doesn't give you nominal wage rigidity, yet you have extreme nominal wage rigidity in these historical data sources. And it makes you wonder, what's the margin of adjustment that is happening? And Judy sort of talks about hours and days worked and like the returns to tenure and things as being important margins of compensation that are just not picked up in the wage. So it's again a wage in which like economic inequality is just like sometimes a misleading proxy for the actually inequality and well-being that we might actually be caring about. Okay, how much time do I have left?
Well, I think we better finish pretty soon.
Okay. Okay. So I will transition to. I will finish in 1 minute. So what? 5? Okay. Great. So, and all of this is just to say, so that's the Malthusian era. That's like the bulk of the historical evidence happens in the Malthusian era. But we have modern war, and I think what Walter's talk, just to expand on it, I think one of the interesting ways is to partition the mechanisms by which modern war reduces inequality into two families. And one is sort of like the Marxian family, where it's just you need citizens to fight and produce for the war effort. So you're quite willing to, because you're facing an existential threat, you're quite willing to transfer economic and political power to citizens in order to get them to both fight and produce for you. And that's kind of like the democracy and the unionization. But then you also need the sort of Keynesian mechanisms in modern war of just run the economy hot and just produce a lot more than you otherwise will. And both of these are both different ways of compressing the income distribution. And what I think is useful that we learn from studying these wartime mechanisms is that they're illustrative, I think, of the general characteristic behind the peaceful measures. It's like when elites need citizens' bronze and brains to do things for them, they will compensate them. So it's like when they need their human capital, when they need their fighting ability, but what is a future, and this segues into Simon's Cup, where elites no longer need citizens' bronze and brains to fight wars. Or in peacetime. And so my analogy for this is, I'm sure a lot of people in this room know this, is this Lynn White kind of famous Great Stirrup controversy. Famous, guys, have you not heard of the Great Stirrup controversy? And basically the argument is that the stirrup created feudalism because it was essentially enabled like a guy in metal with a lance to have the horse drive the lance into Muslims, and that was and basically Charles Martel discovers that the cavalry works really well and sort of comes back and reorganizes landowning patterns to support mounted knights. So the idea is that you set up a knight with a bunch of serfs, and they're able to generate enough surplus to support this kind of fairly capital-intensive form of warfare of a mounted knight. And so what if we sort of think that the actual really important thing about technology is not its effects on the labor market, but actually its effects on military technology. And I kind of have a little bit on the brain these days, but I feel like you look around and you can't help but think of the military as a little bit is on the table again. So what kinds of social systems are kind of the upshot of a world in which the technology has moved away from kind of a labor-intensive form of warfare towards like a autonomous and technologically advanced form of warfare? And this is like the different kinds of military spending on manufacturing jobs gets you different things. So this is from a paper I have with Ilyana Kuziemko in the Cold War. This is during peacetime, and it's an interesting thing because the U.S. during the Cold War spends an enormous amount on peacetime military procurement, and that alone has an effect on inequality. Even though there's not really hot wars, it's still just like the expenditure. But it's particularly the expenditure on the blue-collar stuff like tanks, boots, ammunition, that increases manufacturing employment, reduces inequality. The fancy stuff on research and R&D, on like ICBMs, on airspace, on Star Wars, that has no effect on inequality and no effect on manufacturing employment. And so, my question then kind of for Simon is to invite you to sort of, I'm sure you've thought about this, but, the channel by which technology is presumed to affect society is the labor market. And behind that is kind of, and I told this to Simon before, is the assumption that there's an audience of policymaking elites that care. And maybe it's my generational thing that I'm sufficiently cynical that I'm not sure there's an audience of policymakers that actually care. So in any case, what if this is like less important than the military effects of this, that the repressive effects of, for example, facial recognition in China, or like the automatic bombing of households you're seeing in Gaza, or like the policing of the border, this sort of ability to deliver massive amounts of violence in a super targeted, decentralized way, if that's kind of what's on the table, maybe the effects of technology are less through the labor market and much more through these like kind of deployment of violence. And so then even in terms of inequality, maybe we'll look back and think we're already in kind of like the next war, but it might look less like past wars, just like COVID was not like past plagues. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you.